So welcome everyone, and delighted to have you here today with us at ILSS Online. It's the 39th ILSS Online that we are hosting today, and so delighted to be welcoming Deepak Jayaraman, someone I follow very closely in his seminal podcast, Play to Potential. Today's session is on finding your purpose. I know that resonates with all of you. And before I begin, I'd just like to spend a minute talking about ILSS as the organization. So at ILSS, we really believe that people are the key to achieving lasting social change. Through our learning programs, we seek to nurture and strengthen leadership and capacities for India's development sector for catalytic impact at scale. Our approach really is three-pronged. One is, of course, to bring in talent and infuse the sector with talent, which is what we do through our flagship leadership program, through our corporate board program. Also transform the quality of talent, which we do through supporting NGO leaders with understanding fundraising, understanding people practices. We will also be doing a women's leadership program later on this year. We do teach nonprofit CEOs how to build strong boards. And third, of course, is through knowledge and communities. We want to create create catalytic impact at scale. These are just some of our programs. The flagship leadership program, as you know, is to bring in corporate, not just corporate, private sector leaders to explore the social sector and to see ways of engaging, ideally full-time, but even otherwise in an informed way. It's our oldest program, and the second program we offer is really for social sector leaders, the fundraising program. Which is really, fundraising is the fulcrum of any organization. And you do need to know how to raise funds effectively and strategically and with confidence. People practices really came out of an understanding that the social sector doesn't always have funds, but how do you really learn how to, nurture, hire, retain, and grow the right talent for the social sector organizations? And also board programs. We do have corporate leaders willing to give time, may not be looking at full sort of transitions. So we help them sit on nonprofit boards, but we put them through a learning journey. And similarly, we create a learning journey for nonprofit CEOs to build effective boards. So these are some of our offerings. And I think we can begin. Yes, Deepak, wonderful. I've been following you for so long, so delighted to have you in the hot seat today. Deepak is an executive coach and is the CEO of Transition Insight, where he works with successful senior executives and helps them play to their unique potential by working with them closely during phases of high-stakes transitions. Transitions are often points in time when people are lonely, problems are complex, stakeholders are many, and stakes are high. Deepak finds it fulfilling to make a difference to people at these pivotal points in their journey, through being a sounding board, through being a coach. And if you all haven't listened to Play to Potential, please do. It's a wonderful series of podcasts, thoughtfully curated by Deepak. I have found so much inspiration from listening to them every week. Every so often, I'm going to ask Deepak how many podcasts has he done. I'm not quite sure, but they are fantastic, and I do urge everyone to tune in. So welcome, Deepak. Starting today's discussion with a quote, which was from your website, Transition Insights, which says, "One size does not fit all. It fits nobody." Clayton Christensen. This thought resonates particularly with ILSS's core value of lifelong learning. The question to you here is, in your experience of coaching and interacting with several senior corporate leaders, what are some of the critical aspects of their learning journey they should focus on while preparing for transition?
First of all, thank you, Anu, for having me on this conversation and for the kind words on the podcast. And to answer the question that you asked before I move forward, we are currently we've completed 90 conversations, and actually we just published the 91st guest. So it's been on for 5 years. So we see it as a labor of love for the long term. So thank you for the kind words. I think I must say, talking about Clayton Christensen, one of the books that he's written significantly changed my approach to life. He's written a book called How Will You Measure Your Life? Which I think is a seminal piece of work. And in that context, actually, he makes the connection between how companies think about business models and how we think about life. And actually, he uses an example of a milkshake in a McDonald's, I think. And he says that, depending on the time of the day, in the morning, when somebody buys a milkshake, they're actually doing it as a substitute for breakfast. So they want it to be thick and they want it to last and they want it to be filling. And when people come at 4 p.m., they're actually bringing the younger child, and the child is actually looking for a quick drink, and the parent is quite keen that the child finishes quickly so that they can go home. So I think it stems from that. And he says that if you create a middle of the line milkshake, it's not going to satisfy. Neither will it satisfy the morning person or the afternoon person. I find that inspiring because I find that if we look at each one of us in terms of the skills we have, the context we are coming from in terms of our childhood, upbringing, parenting, ecosystems that we come from, in terms of our family context, whether it's parents, children, spouse, sibling, or our aspirations, each of these is very different. And especially in a country like India, when I think of myself, when you go through some systems like engineering colleges or these schools, there is an element of herd, right? You're a batch of this, you're a batch of 200, and you start assuming that each of the 200 is similar. But as last time goes by, you realize that each one of us, one of the podcast guests was a lady called Anu Madgaonkar, who's the head of, who's a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. And she uses a term that each one of us is an SKU of one, a stock keeping unit of one. And the earlier we recognize our individuality and our individual context, hopefully, therefore, we'll be able to make better choices, which is in line with us, which hopefully helps us play the long game. So I think I could go on for a long time, but I think it stems from this point around the fact that I think it's important for us to recognize our individuality, what makes us special, what makes us distinctive. And the reason this becomes tricky, Anu, is that in the corporate context, a lot of the feedback you get is about what you did well, what you didn't do well in the context of a role. But very often when you're in a point of transition, you're actually saying, what is that role that is my sweet spot, right? And the feedback for that, actually, you never get. What makes you distinctive? Nobody tells you that this is the space where someone like you can add distinctive value. And that's the pursuit, which sometimes can be confusing and lonely. And that's why I say that if you sort of do something, because if you get into social impact because somebody else did it, somebody else found fulfillment, that's often the wrong reason. So it's always helpful to start from within and try and find what is that thing that might make sense for you, specifically in the context of social impact.
No, absolutely. And in fact, for us, we have conversations very often with people who are seeking something. They are looking at transitioning as well. Don't quite think they might want to be in the development sector. And our program, while we've got a lot of modules to it, one of the things is the inner journey. Because the sector is very frustrating and hard. And if you don't know why your why is not sound, then then it's going to frustrate you, and you're going to. And when I first started ILSS, I used to hear, and this is anecdotal, I have no research around this, that 2 out of 3 corporates will move into the social sector and move right out because they just can't deal with the pace or with just so much complexity. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's certainly not true now. For us at ILSS, we've seen that. But Deepak, your journey itself has been a fascinating one. So why don't you, moving from full-time corporate to being an entrepreneur, to being a coach, love to hear what were some of the markers in your journey.
Sure. I would say, without going too far back in time, I come from if I may call it as a treadmill, the treadmill system, right? I went to engineering to IIT Madras, and then I went to IIM Ahmedabad. Then I was a consultant for several years. But if I sort of fast forward that to the point of transition, for me, the move out of consulting was triggered actually by a personal event. I used to be working with McKinsey in the New Jersey office. Around 2008, my father, unfortunately, was diagnosed with late-stage cancer back in India. So my wife, she was kind enough to move back and support me through that transition. So we came back to India, and I think that's the first time I had an opportunity to go on the inner journey, because I got staffed on some non-client work. So in a way, till then, there was no space, given the intensity of life, there was no space to go on the inner journey. So I think first, in a way, that context enabled me to spend some time reflecting on what gave me energy. Till then, I was probably walking around with a hammer looking for a nail to hit. That's the first time I said, what gives me energy? And somehow in McKinsey, all consultants would be evaluated on three broad parameters, right? IQ, CQ, and RQ. IQ is intellect, which is problem solving, your ability to structure complex ideas, etc. CQ is the consulting toolkit, which is about client management, project management, timeline management, scope management, etc. And RQ was the relationship quotient, which was about how are you motivating your teams, how are you engaging with the client. And every consultant would spike in one domain, and my spike was beginning to turn out to be RQ. And one of my mentors at McKinsey, a gentleman called Ramesh Mangaleshwaran, he was kind enough to look at me and said, I have a feeling you might flourish in a search kind of a context. Why don't I introduce you to this firm, Egon Zehnder, which is quite collaborative, and that approach might suit your personality. And I mention this because I find that during these kinds of transitions, very often we are a very poor judge of what else might make sense for us. Very often getting some sort of an outside-in input on somebody that knows you well and somebody who has an insight on you can be immensely valuable in sort of pointing the direction. So around 2008, in a way, that was the crux of the transition. A personal context precipitated the reflection. But I think 2008 Lehman happened, going back to the US became less attractive. So my wife and I, we discussed and we felt maybe we should sort of reorganize our life in India. So that's the crux. 6 years at Egon Zehnder was largely around recruiting CEOs and CXOs for large organizations and board members. I really enjoyed it. I grew a lot. Great mentors in the firm. Over time, I realized that in search, I was spending disproportionate amount of time judging the people around me. It's a bit like a venture capital firm, right? Entrepreneurs come and pitch to you all the time, and it's quite a heady feeling when you're sitting in a position of power, writing checks and saying no to people, saying yes to people. And in a way, it's a bit like that in search, right? At some level, you're broking talent, and people are keen to pitch to you to sort of appear on your lists when you're working on searches. But somehow, this again is an outside-in insight I got from a friend of mine. He said, you seem to have more of a coaching mindset than a poaching mindset. And that was, again, an outside-in insight, which really got me reflecting to say, I enjoyed helping conversations much more than judging conversations. But unfortunately, in a search firm, if I had to belong, if I had to build a career, 80% of my conversations had to be evaluative conversations. Could I do that as a job? Yes. But was I finding it fulfilling? Possibly no. So I think that sort of line of inquiry and discovery took me to pursuing a coaching certification. And the firm initially said, why don't you do this and try and do coaching within Egon Zehnder? But soon I realized that that's around the time I had my second child. He's 8 years old now. He was about a year or two, and that somehow I think the equation on the home front was beginning to change, and I felt I had to sort of moderate the pace, the intensity of my life for me to be able to be sane and provide time for the family. Because in a professional services firm, at the end of the day, somebody else is setting the pace of the treadmill. So that took me to this path I'm on. Calling myself an entrepreneur would be an overstatement. Anu, I would say maybe I would call myself an independent producer, where I spend time with clients as a sounding board, as a coach, as you said, with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and so on. And the podcast, in a way, is like is my 20% project, which I plan to do for the long term. It's just I treat it as my L&D function. It's an opportunity for me to learn and grow, and hopefully bring some of that insight to the work I do, and hopefully also the conversations provoke reflection and hopefully helps people in some way.
Oh, it absolutely does. I'm, like I said, I have been listening to your podcasts. And it's interesting when you say that, Deepak, because I remember when I was at Ashoka University prior to starting ILSS a few years ago. And it was a meeting with Ashish Dhawan, who is our anchor donor, who said, Anu, you're entrepreneurial. So why don't you start this? Because we feel like the sector needs a capacity building organization. And I thought in my mind, I'm entrepreneurial. Yes, of course I am. But it really helped
Great
that you
point.
said that, and so, and I know you did a podcast with him as well.
Yes, yes.
Uh,
And just maybe expanding on that, I think we often, it sort of brings the point about identity, right? I tell people that very often we look at ourselves by traditional labels. I'm an engineer, I'm an MBA graduate, I'm a dentist, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. But very often when others see us, sometimes they see a certain aspect of us that we don't either see or we take for granted. So this point about you're entrepreneurial is probably not something that would have occurred to you. It's always, that's why I request people to combine internal self-reflection with outside-in feedback as they go through the self-awareness journey. So it's a very powerful point you just made.
Deepak, coming to for ILSS, everything does revolve, finally come back to the social sector and philanthropy. But your engagement, because you also have done a lot of, you've engaged with the sector and philanthropy. How did that come about? What was that, a plan or something that sort of propelled you to engage with the work in the social sector more strategically? What was that journey like?
Sure. I would say it's been about 5-6 years, Anu, where I would say I've been a little more deliberate about my involvement. Otherwise, before that, it was probably cutting sporadic checks. It was very ad hoc and probably not thought through. I think, once again, it's quite accidental. One of my former colleagues and a mentor of mine, a gentleman called Govind Iyer, he used to be the managing partner of Egon Zehnder. He said that there's this organization called Social Venture Partners, which is headquartered in Seattle, which is basically a group of well-intentioned philanthropists who pool in a certain sum of money, create a corpus, deploy that corpus in a few organizations, and then assemble teams to work in some of those organizations and advise them and help them. And so I didn't know enough. It was once again a leap of faith. I knew Govind. I knew that he knew me. And as I was transitioning from the corporate world, I was also looking for associating myself with a group of people to belong to some organization. I think there was probably that element as well when I look back. The first wave of organizations, one of the organizations that was selected was an organization called Antarang Foundation. They work with kids in Bombay, Pune, Udaipur, and a few other geographies who come from economically challenged backgrounds, and help them with employability, right? It's not just about finding jobs, but really how do you unlock the attitudes? How do you really make them hungry? How do you give them aspiration? And how do you get them to dream? So I was part of the team. Govind once again said, why don't you, he sort of staffed me. The term that's often used is voluntold. He voluntold me to work with Antarang. So I worked with a couple of others, and I worked with the founder and the leadership team on, just being their sounding board on scaling up their leadership, coaching, etc., culture, and so on. And along the way, as I started fleshing out the podcast, I was looking for somebody to come and edit the podcast. At that point, it occurred to me that given that it's sort of a nascent skill set, and if play to potential is the theme of the podcast, why can't I, put money where the mouth is and bet on potential and bet on one of the kids from Antarang? So the first guy who joined me was a person called Akash. He used to be with a call center, and then he was with the Andheri metro station selling tickets. He was a ticket selling officer. But I asked the founder, Priya, saying, I don't care about the background, right? As long as the kid has potential, I'm happy to back the potential. So in a way, that's how he joined us, and he's been with us for 5-6 years. The next guy who joined us was a barista at Starbucks. Once again, no background, but he was hungry to grow, hungry to learn, and he was looking for the right exposure. So now the two of them work with me, and I see it as an opportunity to hopefully make a difference to the trajectory in their careers and their journeys, and hopefully support them. So after Akash joined, I sponsored him to study, do his bachelor's in media, and so on. I'm sort of treating them as my sort of almost like my adopted children, right? In terms of being with them, not just an employer, but really being with them through the journey. So the one thing I've realized, Anu, is scale doesn't appeal to me. Paradoxically, for a lot of people, scale gives them a high, and I do realize that a lot of the problems in India are large scale problems, but I felt I wanted to stay true to what gave me energy. And I said, let me, even the advisory, I thought about it. I said somehow spending time as a surgeon would be more energizing than building a hospital. You know, that's sort of the crux of the distinction I made. And even here, I said, I've done some work with SVP. And the other thing that interested me about SVP was it would give me an opportunity to mingle with like-minded people. Otherwise, I realized that sometimes the journey in the impact sector can be lonely. You know, you're the only corporate player, everyone else is of a different profile. So I felt here there was a little bit of a camaraderie. There was a little bit of also a widening of the aperture on what's going on in the other organizations. So that was the context of the joining. But I think what I wanted to say was one thing has led to another. SVP led to involvement with Antarang, led to me recruiting these two people. So I use the podcast as a platform for people to pay it forward to Antarang. So in a way, it's a journey. It's still evolving. But I would say it started off as an accident, but I'm finding my way through it.
Oh, that's fascinating. And, thank you so much for sharing that. I actually coming to, so, the things that you focus on are leadership, transitions, careers. I want to understand from you through on transitions. Do you see through the COVID period, Deepak, that there's been a shift sort of in more purpose-driven, non-conventional? Do you see people being more reflective now? Is there been do you sense a feeling of people are sort of hitting pause and sort of looking at where they are at, because it's almost allowed you to be reflective a little bit? And so are you sensing that in your in your interactions with leaders, that this has been, there's something has shifted in the way people are thinking about purpose and what are they doing and where are they headed, and that self-reflection? Are you sensing any of that?
I think the short answer is yes. I know. One of the guests on the podcast was a professor from Wharton, a gentleman called Stu Friedman, who talks about 4 domains of life: self, work, home, and community. He says self is about mental, physical, spiritual health. Work is the time you spend at work. Home is the time you spend with near and dear, family and close friends. And community is what you do for people beyond either work or immediate family. And I think what COVID has done is really brought all these 4 elements front and center, right? Otherwise, people are typically focused on work and maybe family. But I think COVID has brought in the importance of health, both physical and mental health on the self side. And it sort of, in a way, shined the spotlight on the human condition, right? If I may say, human suffering, given how different sections of the society got impacted. There was you couldn't not observe what was going on around you, right? I think whether it's Black Lives Matters and stuff that's happening in the US, or whether it's things happening in Dharavi in Bombay, or whether it's people not having oxygen cylinders in Delhi or wherever, right? I think there was just so much that was hitting you. So in a way, I think to your question, I do think COVID has served as a timeout. And this again was a phrase used by another guest of mine called Tenzin Priyadarshi. He's a monk who's now at MIT teaching ethics. He says COVID is a massive timeout for mankind. God has just sort of put man in a room to say, figure out your stuff in terms of your role, your purpose, what you're doing to the climate, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think COVID has brought probably all these 4 domains to people attention. Otherwise, people were probably treating it as a single piece or a 2-piece jigsaw at best. Even, but I think the self part, the family part, and the community part. I think it's like in the night, if you know that there's a mosquito in the room, you can't just ignore. It's going to come back and hit you. So I think it's one of those things where yes, there is a small section of people where the world has opened up and they're back to the treadmill. But I do think to switch to Hindi, there's a little bit of a kida that's been planted, which will hopefully get them to reflect and get them to a better place over time.
Well, we certainly hope so, Deepak. For us, we think every citizen of this country really needs to be thinking in terms of being active citizens,
Right.
So COVID has had that. We see that too, by the way. At ILSS, we do have a lot of people reaching out saying we're wondering where we're going and we want to do something, not quite sure, looking to explore the development sector, but also other, other opportunities for themselves. I will ask one last question, and then I know there are questions coming into the chat box. So, when considering their transitions to a different sector, many senior leaders, especially in the social impact space, are unclear on how they could leverage their skills and experience in a new sector. What's your take on skills being transferable, especially for senior leaders who may have worked in a particular sector domain for most of their careers? And I get that a lot, Deepak, when I'm having conversations with people who are thinking about a transition, and they say, especially with the development sector, they say, we don't know what we don't know. Obviously, we are not subject matter experts. So what can we do? I'm from marketing. What is the sector going to do with my skill set? So, how do you how would you address some of these questions?
I think it's the answer lies in the phrase you used in framing the question. What you don't know what you don't know, right? I think if you sort of come in with that humility, so therefore, I think a couple of things, right? One is about humility about what you don't know. I think Ashish Dhawan, who you spoke about in the podcast, one of the terms he used which stayed with me was that the production function of the impact sector is very different from the corporate sector. There are just so many more forces to contend with. It's just much, much more complex, and problems are a lot more intractable than in the corporate world, right? Even, just to take the example of Antarang, one of the things they said was, sometimes we think we are doing something that's beneficial for the beneficiary. But the founder, Priya Agarwal, would tell me, but you'd be surprised that you actually need to go and convince them that this is good for them. It's not, you might think that it's obvious, but they may not see the value in what you're doing. So it just, it's a bit like, when you're trying to sell Coke to a kid, when I say Coca-Cola to a kid, you know that the child wants it and the child will drink it if you place a bottle of Coca-Cola in front of the child. But in social sector, even the demand is not obvious. You need to create the demand. You need to convince the consumer that he or she needs the service or the product. So I think one is about humility around what you don't know. I think it's important. And second is, given the fact that what you don't know is much bigger than what you know, I find that an experimentative approach to this transition is better. Treat it as a journey and don't treat it as a big bang. Here's the magic answer. I want to be, let's say you might have been in the finance function. Maybe the default assumption you might make is I'll transition to fundraising in this, or I might move to the finance function in this. Such big bang or heavy commitments might lead to people finding themselves in a funny place. So one of my guests, a lady called Herminia Ibarra, used a term which stayed with me. She says that you need to act your way to a new way of thinking rather than think your way into a new way of acting. So I think if people can sort of keep that experimentative mindset and try a few things, see what they enjoy. Because the other thing I realize is in any transition, not just to the social sector, as they say in Hindi, right? Jo hai wo dikhta nahi hai, jo dikhta hai wo hai nahi. You might think that you might enjoy something, but you spend 2 weeks and you're sort of pulling teeth saying, where am I stuck? So just come in with an open mind, craft experiments, and see where you're enjoying. What you thought would be fun, is it still fun? Because purpose is good, but sometimes I think we also need to find activities that energize us. If we are doing something deeply purposeful, but the activity in itself is draining, it might be difficult to play the long game. So those are the two thoughts that come to mind.
No, absolutely. And I think humility for us too is key, because you may be very successful in the corporate world, but you're coming into a very, very different, very complex, challenging space. And so, sometimes that whole hardwiring is a problem, and even sometimes the rescue mindset. Or the savior mindset, like I'm going to come and tell you how to do things. It doesn't work. And we spend a lot of time orienting our leaders on the fact that do active listening, ask more questions than trying to give solutions initially, because you don't really know, and it'll unpack as you go along. And we see the aha moments, just like I see aha moments when I listen to Play to Potential. And in fact, the wonderful one you did recently on the happiness, where you
Yes.
shared It was wonderful because one of the quotes that resonated with me was from Marshall Goldsmith. No surprises there, but I think it'll be important for the audience to hear it. He said, "We don't regret the risks we took and failed. We regret the risks we failed to take." So, really urging everyone to sort of go out there and, try this with an open mind, with a learning mindset. And there's so much joy in actually, I believe, in really being a part of the solution. One last question. I know the questions are adding up, but I just wanted to ask you one last question, Deepak, before I do open it up. If we keep aside transitions at a macro level, do you think the definition of a leader today in the corporate world is changing? And you have rich contact, Amy Edmondson, Herminia Ibarra. You're talking to some of the most leading thinkers today. So does it also mean someone fully committed to sustainability, diversity, inclusion? So therefore, for people in the corporate world, leadership today is much more nuanced to be more sort of socially responsible. What is your view on what is leadership today, and also how people understand leadership? Because it's a journey in itself. And so how do you think it's evolving? If you could share a little bit of your thoughts on how leadership is evolving today.
Yeah. Couple of thoughts here, Anu. One is, I think the most succinct expression of this actually was again from one of my mentors and a guest on the podcast, Ravi Venkatesan.
I interviewed him just a couple of months ago on his new book.
Oh, lovely. Oh, lovely. What the heck do I do with my life? I think he uses a phrase which I find intuitive and informative. He says leadership is a verb, not a title. And to me, that encapsulates the point, saying, you could be anybody. You could be a 10-year-old, Greta Thunberg, right? She's not, nobody called her a leader, but she took initiative, right? Our daughter, as part of one of our projects, was studying the Design for Change project that was initiated, where kids could take charge, and how they came up with innovative solutions in several countries, and how some of that thinking can be used by children. And she ran with a project with Akanksha Foundation, and led a group of people to engage with them. So I think one point I want to make is, I feel the more we relate to it as a verb, and the fact that all of us can have agency to make a difference, whatever that might be in our own realm. I think hopefully we can make a bigger difference. We don't have to wait for some leader with some title somewhere to tell us what to do. I think the answer is a lot more individual than we think it is. That's one. Second, I think leadership today, and this is sort of a broader point, not just in the development sector, is I think it's a lot more of inspire and enroll, and less of command and control. Right. Earlier, you had a certain authority, you had some resources, and you would deploy those resources in a certain centralized way. But I think now, it's become a lot more of, you show up in a certain way. A bunch of people start coming towards you, and your sphere of influence widens. And then with that influence, and with that, let's say, trust in the ecosystem, you start developing a bigger and bigger flywheel, and that sort of eventually takes you somewhere. So it's a lot more, I think, leadership. And I think one of my other guests, a gentleman called Arun Maira, he talks about this notion of leadership in an open system versus closed system. It's about, he uses the example of Gandhiji, right? When he came in for the freedom movement, he was not some state head. He was one of the citizens, but slowly, as people realized that he was able to rally people around, mobilize people, his stature grew. He went from one place to another, and so on. And he was able to galvanize an entire country to fight a certain battle and get us independence. So I think the second point I would make is it's sort of, the more we focus on who we are, what's our purpose, and show up in a certain way. The movie scene that comes to mind is Forrest Gump. I know Amir Khan is making a sort of a remake of Forrest Gump, but there's a beautiful scene where Tom Hanks just starts running, He just runs solo, and suddenly people start following him. And within a couple of days or whatever, there are thousands of people behind him. And one day he just stops and says, "Why are you running behind me?" He just says, "Because you're an inspiration." So I feel it's a lot more of inspire and enroll. What do you believe in? What do you stand for? How do you show up? And depending on how you want to shape it, people start trusting you, and then you develop a certain influence, and then you make a difference. So those are the two thoughts that come to mind. The fact that anybody could be a leader, and second is it's more inspire and enroll and less command and control.
Absolutely. I am going to ask you question. And in fact, I do actually find that you see the best kind of leadership in the development sector, because because people are passion and values and work driven. There's no money.
Yes.
Right? It's
Yes.
not like you're working for the bonus or the ESOPs. You're
Yes.
working because your sort of values align. And so that leader who sort of takes everyone along on that vision is harder in so many
Yes.
ways, but also exactly what you were speaking about. There's a question I can see here which says, Deepak, do you think there is a timeline of making a career shift? How late is too late?
Wow. See, I think one of the guests on my podcast was a lady called Linda Grattan, and she's written a book called 100-Year Life. And her point is we all are going to, given the advances in healthcare, people are going to live longer and longer. A lot of them into the 90s and hundreds. And the crux of what she says is most of us will have to be engaged in some form of work or sorts into our 70s and 80s, right? So yeah, it's never too late. I think very often we are in our 30s and 40s and we start saying, is it too late? But I think the only piece to highlight is I think there is a role of money. I think there is a question of how do you relate to money? What is the role it has? What are the responsibilities you have? Have you sort of crossed the point of financial independence, et cetera, that needs to be navigated. But otherwise, I feel if we start with the assumption that a lot of us need to be engaged and in some sort of work into our 70s and 80s, unless you're 95, I think it's not too late is the answer that comes to mind.
I agree. I don't see myself stopping anytime.
Yeah, I think even at 95, there's a lady called Edith Eger. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a Holocaust survivor, and she's, I think, 92 or 93, and she's written a book at 92, 93 because she wants to inspire people about having agency even in the most harshest of situations. So never too late, I'm guessing.
Never too late, never too late. This is a question from Nishit. Oh, hi, Nishit, from Gurgaon. Can you give a sense from your experience of what proportion of corporate executives love the transition to social sector and are happy versus those who feel disillusioned after the move and either look to move back or force quit themselves into their new roles? Wow.
So Anu, here you might have a more data to respond to it. Mine is a lot more anecdotal and spotty. But I think that's why I feel the less we see it as a binary answer to say I've shifted. It's almost like Arya Par kind of a discussion, right? I feel then that misses the point. I feel if we can reframe it as how do I find a way of staying engaged with the sector so that it makes sense for my life context and what gives me energy, I feel we'll find an answer that makes sense. But if we sort of treat it as almost as a discrete jump, saying, okay, my corporate stint is over, I'm jumping to the development sector, then I feel we might find ourselves in a funny place. Now, what percentage of people are where? Honestly, I don't have a statistical answer. You might have a view, but I think maybe just to expand on what I said, what I found interesting is different people have found different ways of giving, right? For example, Vedika Bhandarkar was a lady who was on the podcast. She used to be a banker at Credit Suisse. She said, I know financing, I'm passionate about women's empowerment. Can I sort of help find funding for water? So she now is the CEO for water.org. Nanda Nilekani, who was on the podcast, said, what makes me distinctive is my ability to solve intractable tech problems as a as somebody who can orchestrate, and he's done Aadhaar, he's doing Egg Step, he's doing a few things based on that. I spoke to Vinita Bali, who was in Britannia. She said, since I was in the foods business, I said, let me work on nutrition. And she worked on a global alliance in nutrition. So I think as long as we can find something that resonates with us, that builds on our skills, and the mode of engagement is in line with what matters to us. I also realize that there's an architectural decision to be made. Do we want a portfolio kind of a thing, or do we want one thing? Some people might find greater energy in picking that one thing and being a CEO in an organization, and a social impact organization. And some people might be better off maybe engaging with 5 different organizations on a 10-20% capacity. So I think, I feel people sometimes overthink the cause they are going after, but underthink the mode of engagement. I think that's a big piece to solve. And the more iterative we can make it, hopefully there'll be fewer people disillusioned with the transition.
No, absolutely, Deepak. And in fact, one of the things that I'm routinely asked is, where do I transition? What do I do? And I'm always saying that, just walk 100 feet down a road and you'll find, unfortunately, in this country and in so many parts, so there's so much that one can do. So just, have the conversations, look around you.
What moves you?
What moves you, and then pick that up, like you rightly said, with Benita Bali and her getting into nutrition. There's so many areas that are underserved that you could really work in. So it's a journey, and so I think there's anxiety. I sense sometimes this anxiety. I think one needs to just start having conversations, so sparks will happen, and start meeting.
If I may add one point, I think also evaluate the adjacent possible, right? I think this is a term that a professor called Cal Newport uses. He says sometimes we take a deep plunge, but if you can evaluate the adjacent possible, the other person that comes to mind is Viren Raskina, who was a captain of India. He went to ISB, and then he was almost about to take up a job in a consulting organization when Geet Sethi and Prakash Padukone reached out to him. Now he runs Olympic Gold Quest. So he's moved from an athlete to running an organization that helps produce Olympians. So finding the transition, even if we take cricket, right? For example, someone like Rahul Dravid has turned into a coach. Someone like a Saurav Ganguly is more into administration. So each one has found someone like a Sunil Gavaskar is into commentary. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the role that would energize us? And I think you can only experiment your way. You can't think your way through it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting question from Arshal Akhtar. I'm from Guwahati, and I'm working towards advocating for sustainable active urban transportation. I co-founded, where did it go? Isha, did you just remove the question?
No, I think the person did, but the whole question was how they can raise funds. I think
he wanted to know, if you could help him raise funds. So, or you could suggest what are ways to raise funds. Also, this is an interesting question. Is there a way to transition slowly? Transition doesn't have to be in the development sector. Transition is, any shifts in your career. And, I often quote, Sheryl Sandberg, who says that careers are not ladders but jungle gyms, because
yes.
And for millennials and maybe Gen Zs, it will be more. There'll be many transitions go. But is there, what are the different avenues to get involved with a transition process? Is a question by Anuja Apte.
I think slow is good. I think once again, I asked this question to this lady, Herminia Ibarra, who's considered sort of the leading thinker on career reinvention. And when I asked her, do you have a sense on what is the median number, the time it takes to change trajectories? And she said 2 to 3 years. And a couple of things she talks about is, exploration and commitment, right? How widely do you explore and how quickly do you commit? And what she advocates is divergent exploration and delayed commitment. And very often we don't explore enough and we commit too soon. If you really look at how people make choices, typically it's like a trapeze artist in a circus, right? You leave a trapeze and you want to get on to the next trapeze.
Absolutely.
right? And unfortunately, when it comes to reinvention, you need to move away from the trapeze mindset, because most of if you look at our life, after 12th, there is a trapeze that appears. After our undergrad, there's a trapeze that appears either in terms of a postgrad or a job. But I think when it comes to reinvention, it needs to, I think that metaphor starts breaking down, and you need to sort of really explore different things, construct experiments. And she uses the term, right? Test and iterate beats plan and implement as a strategy. Very often our approach is plan, implement. But here, I think it's a lot more of prototyping, a little bit of that design thinking approach of what are those 4 experiments we can try? What am I enjoying? Like Nandan spoke about it, right? One of the questions I asked him was, you moved from UID to contesting the Lok Sabha elections in Bangalore and you lost. Then what happened? He said, I thought Lok Sabha would give me a legitimate ticket to the parliament. But when I went there, I realized that politics is a B2C business. He said, I'm a B2B guy. And, I'm not the guy that's good at making speeches, rallying the people, whipping up emotion in the crowd. That's not me. That's not what makes me distinctive. So I sort of said, maybe this is the wrong path. And he came back to being the tech evangelist and do other things. So I think somewhere, yes, there will be some misses. Yes, there will be some false steps. But as long as you treat that as an input into your self-discovery, hopefully you'll find a pathway that makes sense for you.
And in fact, it's interesting, Deepak, that you talk about the trapeze artist, because sometimes I do feel like sometimes it's okay to just burn your bridges. I do have some times people thinking transition, but want to still hold on to this, the security of what they know and they're familiar with. And it's absolutely okay to, but sometimes it's okay to just burn your bridges and just commit one way or the other. There is a question by Akshay Shah on any resources, books to read and research on transitions. I would say, guys, listen to the podcast. There's a wealth of information and wonderful speakers curated by Deepak. But Deepak, any books that particularly stand out for you?
Sure. And I've had the opportunity to interview these people on the podcast as well. So one book that I suggest to a lot of people is Working Identity by Herminia Ibarra. She's been on the podcast and she talks about it. The other book I suggest to people is a book called Life is in the Transitions by Bruce Feiler. He's been kind enough to come on the podcast as well. And the third book I might suggest is a book called Halftime by Bob Buford, which is largely about him being a successful media executive and how do you move from success to significance, right? And I also spoke to one of the people. They run something called the Halftime Institute, which helps people move from success to significance. So you can look them up in the guest section at playtopotential.com. Or the other thing I might suggest is if you go to the curated playlist section at playtopotential.com, one of the playlists is Reinventing Self and Navigational Principles. There you might have these 3-minute, 5-minute capsules from different people. For example, there, it's not just about social impact, right? I spoke to Amish Tripathi. How did you transition from the financial services world to writing? He spoke about how he kept writing and he only switched when the royalty check from the book exceeded the salary from the job, because he said, I had a family. I didn't have the luxury of just jumping ship. I had to keep it gradual and keep it as a side project till it became commercially meaningful. And I didn't want to put commercial pressure on it early because otherwise I would have killed the creativity. So I think the answer varies, but these 3 books and these podcast resources might get you started.
There is a question from Ramonica, and sorry guys, I'm not going in order, but I'm just picking up the questions that sort of resonate. There are lots of questions and I may not be able to get Deepak to answer all of them. Ramonica asks, what's the best way to deal with people and individual agendas without the guardrails of structure and hierarchy like in the corporate world? What would you advise? So Ramonica is really transitioned and is...
It's an open-ended question. It's a tough one. It's quite contextual. I find it difficult to answer it. I think very often in a corporate context, you have the structure and the authority to fall back on to deal with a certain situation. In social sector, I find that very often you need to probably reconcile very often with what's your purpose much more than you do in the corporate world. In the corporate world, very often the role, the structure, the org chart often defines how you will behave in a certain way. In the social sector, one thing I've noticed with some of my work with the founders is very often you ask yourself, why am I here? Is this core to my mission? Is this the right thing for me to do? And one of the terms that one of the CEOs I've worked with is a gentleman called Saurabh Taneja, who heads Akanksha Foundation. And he used a phrase which stayed with me. He said, there's always a seat on the table for the child. You know, in the boardroom, we have 10 board members, but I don't forget that one of the seats has to be occupied by the child. And the reason I mention it is I think you will get pulled in multiple directions, multiple forces, but as long as you're clear about the why, you're solving for the stakeholder who's central to your life, to your organization's mission, to your mission, hopefully you'll resolve it. But otherwise, it's quite it's a contextual question.
Yes. Assuming that the domain knowledge or expertise may not be too relevant in development sector roles, and once you take that domain expertise away, how good or effective is a corporate leader could be in a, so basically once you take away your expertise, what does a corporate leader bring into the development sector?
So once again, the starting assumption I feel requires a rethink. In the sense, I do think several capabilities are relevant in the development sector, but maybe the question the person is asking is, let's say if it's a CFO moving in, apart from the finance skills, what else can I bring, right? If I take the finance element away, what else can I do? I think this goes back to the point about identity and our skill sets. I feel if the more wider we can be, very often we don't see ourselves as some of the other things we do, right? We might be a galvanizer of people. We might be good in storytelling. We might be good in convincing people and in pitching to clients and fundraising. Maybe we might have done it in different contexts. We might not have done it in the role. Or we might be good at culture building and holding a group of people together. So maybe not just getting consumed by the work title and the functional title and that identity, but really thinking a little broader about what are the different assets. And sometimes, there are different kinds of social capital, right? Your network, who you're connected to is a social capital. The trust you have in the ecosystem is social capital. For example, when I say pay it forward to Antarang, at some level, I'm sort of using the trust people have with the podcast to hopefully make a difference to Antarang Foundation. And that's the intangible asset that I'm using to hopefully make a difference to them. So I think the more we can think about some of the other forms of intangible assets and other forms of capital that we bring, whether it's networks or capabilities or trust or something else, hopefully we can add value beyond just the functional skill set, which we use to define ourselves.
No, absolutely. And Deepak, because I've seen now so many transitions, close to 300 senior leaders come through our program, very honestly saying they don't know what they don't know. Many of them say that, but I really feel like it's how your attitude that finally helps you transition, how open you are, how many conversations you're willing to have, just to learn, how your learnability. Because learnability needs to be an ongoing thing. It can't end after you've not arrived. When you hit you have to be a continuous learner, and you have to enjoy the learning process and be okay to say, hey, I didn't know this, and it's good. So I have seen that the best transitions for me personally have been people who have exhibited a certain attitude of mind, a very positive attitude, happy to have these conversations, patience, not like fretting. Fretting isn't going to get you anywhere, just...
The other point I might build on, Anu, there is I've noticed that sometimes people who do well in the corporate world often come from a place of good pedigree, right? They've been to fantastic institutes, whether it's Stephens or Xavier's or IIT or NLS or IIMS or ISB or wherever. And often when they look at some of the leaders in the social impact sector, maybe from a pedigree perspective, they may not tick those boxes. So there's I've noticed that there could be a tendency to quickly judge the capability. But I think the more humility we bring and the more maturity we bring in to understand that leadership is much, much more than some gate you crossed 20, 25 years back, to say that people, demonstrate all kinds of leadership. I think that also ensures, I think that lack of sort of minimizing judgment and opening up the curiosity and opening up that humility and willingness to learn, I find that sometimes can go a long way in not just you discovering and exploring, but in the way you engage with the organization. But very quickly, I've noticed that the social impact leaders don't have patience or tolerance for people who sort of technically in the corporate world might have been there, done that. But if you don't bring in the right humility, then it's unfortunately A, it's pointless, and B, it's not helpful. It often ends up in a funny place.
Yes. In fact, for me, the learning was when I was interviewing for my leadership program, someone who was 64, and he had applied. And I'll be honest, Deepak, I went into that interview full of judgment, thinking, this is kind of late and so on. And he blew me away. He's been a part of our cohort now. He knows who he is. I'm not going to take his name. Just in terms of zest, enthusiasm, attitude, positivity. So age is a state of mind. And I hate it when people say, oh, and the social sector does this too, because, often they'll say, we don't want people older than this age. And I'm like, please don't go there, because these are people submitting to learning. So they are putting themselves out there. So, let's not go into that age thing. It's a state of mind. Meet them and see how that goes. One last question, because I know we are out of time, and there are a couple of questions here, but I want to ask you about failure.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, how would you, coach people to look at failure, especially when, like you said, many times you come from in the corporate world, there's a whole ecosystem that's supporting you. You're coming into an unknown space, whatever that is. Now you're suddenly again, back to square one. That halo isn't around you. You have to now prove yourselves. What have you coached people on how to approach failure?
It's a good question, Anu. Once again, it's highly contextual, but the one thing I would urge to explore is it maybe it's worth focusing on what is it teaching you, right? Is it a question of a talent market fit? In a sense, is it that is it like if I were to use the example of Nandan Nilekani, right? That he sort of said, you could call that a failure, but he sort of diagnosed that to be, yes, this was probably the wrong talent market fit. We talk about product market fit a lot, but we don't talk enough about talent or attitude market fit. So I think, so the one question worth reflecting on is, where does it stem from and what does it tell us? Is it the fact that I found myself in the wrong place? Or is it that I didn't get along with a certain kind of people and maybe I should associate myself with a different set of stakeholders? Or is it that I didn't bring my A game and I didn't sort of bring the humility? So I think the one piece I urge the coaches I work with is to really indulge in a combination of reflection and seeking feedback from the people with humility on what went wrong or what went well. And very often here, I want to make a distinction, right? I think just like businesses are solving where to play and how to win, we all are solving where to go and how to grow, right? When you're in a transition, you're actually solving a where to go problem. You're not solving a how to grow problem. I'm not saying it's not binary. We at some stage, we are dealing with a combination of the two, but the primary emphasis is where to go. Where should I take my ship? So as long as we are sort of using that as an opportunity as a signal to tell us about who we are, what drives us, what kind of people we associate ourselves with. Let me take social venture partners as an example, right? A few partners came. Some of them felt that they wanted to sink their teeth deeper into one thing and not this thing, and it didn't work for them, and they moved on. Now, maybe even calling it a failure might be, sometimes even language can inform the way we look at things, right? Maybe rather than failure, maybe we say this didn't work out. So what does it mean, and how do I take it forward? So just maybe treating it as a data point to inform the journey rather than a failure and sort of catastrophizing it could be a good place to start.
That's fantastic. Deepak, one last question. We are literally out of time. What makes Deepak sort of jump out of bed in the morning? What keeps you going?
I think genuinely having good conversations with good people. If I had to really distill it, on the advisory side, I like to work with people who have a growth mindset and who sort of lean into the work I do. It doesn't feel like I'm pushing. I tell people, right, in a coach-coachee relationship, it's much more to do with the coachee than the coach. So I really enjoy those conversations, and those conversations are an opportunity for me to reflect and grow as well. Whenever I'm working in a coaching conversation, each podcast conversation is an opportunity for me to learn and reflect and grow. So I think one is just this privilege to have good conversations with good people. Second is genuinely, really have a good time with the people around you, right? Our family is into music. Each one of us learns an instrument. My son and I learn the guitar. My wife and my daughter learn the piano. And the three of them learn dance. So I think genuinely the other thing that really energizes me about life is just the fact that you get to spend time with people that you love and people that love you, and it makes it worth the while.
That's wonderful. And Deepak, I like to end with your happiness podcast, where Marshall Goldsmith says to you that one of the things he believes in is be happy now.
Yes.
And he actually said you look too serious, and he would do
Yes.
anything in the world to
Yes.
get the 27 years you have on him.
Very true.
All the
Very
books,
true.
all the money, doesn't matter. He would want those 27 years now. So I thought that was really powerful. Be happy now. Thank you so much, Deepak. It's been phenomenal learning from you, listening to you, and having you in the hot seat.
Thank you, Anna.
And keep doing what you're doing, and we will enjoy listening to you. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And do post your comments in the chat box. We will share them with Deepak. And Isha, do you have a final slide that you want to project? That happens for us. But thank you, everyone. Good evening. And thank you, Deepak, once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna.